Late 1978. A secure facility, Moscow Oblast, USSR. The room is a tomb of static and fluorescent light. The air tastes of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and ozone from overheated cathode ray tubes. Glowing green radar sweeps paint the faces of Soviet signals intelligence officers in a sickly, periodic hue. But in an adjacent, vault-like analysis cell, the atmosphere is different, strained, silent, thick with a palpable sense of cognitive dissonance. A senior analyst from the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate, adjusts his glasses. Before him is a photograph, not taken from an airplane, but from an American spy satellite, procured through a shadowy source. It is not a grainy, indistinct blob of strategic infrastructure. It shows a Soviet military motor pool somewhere in East Germany. The vehicles are clear, their models distinguishable. And there, in the foreground, lying on the oily tarmac, is a mechanic's toolbox. Next to it, a discarded rag. The analyst's finger, trembling slightly, traces a line on the glossy paper to a small, dark rectangular object near the toolbox. He brings a magnifying loupe to his eye. The detail resolves. It is a Pravda newspaper, left on a bench. The date on the masthead is legible. He leans back, removes his glasses, and rubs the bridge of his nose. A junior technician waits for his assessment. The analyst does not speak of resolutions or lens diameters. He voices the core, destabilizing suspicion that has been growing for months in the halls of Soviet intelligence. A statement born not of technical evaluation, but of sheer, defensive disbelief. "This is a falsification," he mutters, his voice low and firm. "A provocatia. The Americans want us to waste resources chasing ghosts. No optical system, from orbit, through the atmosphere, it is physically impossible. They cannot see this." He pushes the photograph away, as if touching it contaminated the very principle of strategic secrecy. In that moment of denial, within the heart of the Soviet intelligence machine, lay the ultimate testament to an American technological leap that had already rendered the world transparent. The veil had been lifted. But the first, most critical observer refused to believe his own eyes. This refusal was the opening chapter in one of the Cold War's most pivotal intelligence shocks, a story that begins not in space, but in the desperate skies of a previous decade. For the first decade and a half of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain was also a shroud of impenetrable secrecy. Western intelligence agencies were blind. Agents on the ground risked everything for fragments of information. Reconnaissance aircraft, like the British Canberra, flew perilous, shallow penetrations along the borders, their cameras capturing only the outermost edges of the Soviet Empire. The vast interior, the missile silos, the bomber bases, the nuclear research cities, remained a terrifying mystery. This intelligence blackout fueled a pathology of fear in Washington. Strategic planning was based on a bomber gap and later a missile gap, worst-case scenarios inflated by a lack of hard facts. The United States was preparing to fight a shadow. The solution, audacious and temporary, was the Lockheed U-2. Designed by Kelly Johnson's legendary Skunk Works, it was more a powered glider than an airplane, its long, slender wings allowing it to soar above 70,000 feet, a height believed unreachable by Soviet interceptors or missiles. From 1956, the U-2, painted in sinister matte black, began its silent incursions. Pilots, encased in pressure suits, became high-altitude astronauts, navigating by sextant over the endless steppe. Their Hikon cameras captured breathtaking detail. For the first time, the CIA could map Soviet military infrastructure with precision. The psychological impact on the Soviet leadership was profound. They knew they were being watched but were powerless to stop it. Their airspace, the sacred territory of the USSR, had been violated with impunity. This impunity ended on May 1, 1960. A U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was not just intercepted but destroyed by a new Soviet SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile over Sverdlovsk. The myth of invulnerability shattered. The captured pilot, the wreckage, and the camera film were paraded by Nikita Khrushchev, humiliating the Eisenhower administration and cratering a major summit. The era of the manned overflight was over. The sky was no longer a sanctuary. The need for a new, inviolable platform became an existential priority for American intelligence. The answer, already in nascent development, would have to come from beyond the atmosphere. Even before the U-2 fell, visionary minds had looked to space. The WS-117L program, initiated in 1956, explored satellite reconnaissance. Its Corona sub-program took on desperate urgency after May 1960. The concept was revolutionary, yet brutally simple in principle: launch a camera into orbit, point it at the USSR, shoot film, then physically return the footage to Earth in a heavily shielded re-entry capsule. The engineering was a nightmare of precision and miniaturization, plagued by catastrophic failures. The first successful mission, Corona Mission 9009, finally occurred on August 18, 1960. Its single, recovered film capsule provided more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than all previous U-2 missions combined. The missile gap was revealed to be a fiction. The Soviet ICBM force was tiny. In a single stroke, strategic stability was born from a canister of 70mm film descending under a parachute over the Pacific. But Corona and its successors, the higher-resolution Gambit series, had a fundamental, maddening weakness. They were film return systems. They shot, they stored, they dropped. The take, as it was called, then had to be recovered by aircraft, flown to processing labs in Rochester, New York, analyzed, and distributed. The time from snapshot to analyst's desk could be weeks. It was intelligence archaeology, not surveillance. For monitoring dynamic threats, a missile crisis, the movement of armies, it was dangerously slow. The need was for a real-time eye. An eye that could not just look, but watch. An eye that could, in the parlance that would soon haunt Soviet analysts, read a license plate from space. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the definitive proof of concept for satellite reconnaissance, and its most terrifying indictment of its limitations. Corona satellites provided the broad area search that confirmed the absence of Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba earlier in the year. But when the U-2 flights of Major Richard Hazer and others discovered the missile sites under construction, new, frantic need emerged: persistent, timely monitoring. How quickly were the launchers being assembled? Were nuclear warheads present? Was the Soviet fleet altering course? Film return satellites could not answer these questions fast enough. The world stood on the brink because intelligence, while definitive in proof, was lagging in pace. The crisis was ultimately diffused through a combination of aerial photography and political will, but the lesson was seared into the consciousness of the U.S. intelligence community: to manage a crisis, you must see it unfold in real time. This drove the development of interim systems. The first step was the KH-11 Gambit, a high-resolution film return satellite with a ground resolution reported to be as fine as 2 feet. It was a superb national technical means for treaty verification, capable of seeing individual missiles in their silos. Its successor, the KH-8 Gambit 3, was even more capable. But they still relied on the physical return of film. The parallel push was for electronic readout. The KH-9 Hexagon, dubbed Big Bird, was a marvel, combining wide-area search cameras with a high-resolution spotting camera, and it too returned film buckets. But alongside it flew a more revolutionary, if less capable, system, the KH-11 prototype. The race was for a sensor that could bypass film entirely. The solution lay in a nascent technology, the charge-coupled device, or CCD. Instead of capturing light on photosensitive chemicals, a CCD converts light into electronic signals, digital pixels. This data could be beamed instantly to a ground station via a relay satellite, transforming the intelligence timeline from weeks to minutes. The project, shrouded in immense secrecy under the code name KENNEN, to know, was the highest of high priorities. Lockheed, builder of the U-2 and Corona, won the contract. PerkinElmer, a leader in optics, was tasked with building the heart of the system, a large-diameter mirror telescope of unprecedented quality for space, a Hubble Space Telescope pointed relentlessly at Earth. The technical hurdles were staggering. The mirror had to be ground to a perfection that would not distort a wavelength of light. The spacecraft, stabilized to a degree never before achieved, had to hold its gaze steady on a target from over 150 miles up, while moving at 17,500 miles per hour. The CCD sensors, in their infancy, had to be reliably sensitive. And the entire, multi-billion-dollar system had to be launched on a Titan III rocket into a polar orbit, passing over every point on the globe as the Earth rotated beneath it. The program was so secret that its very existence was known only to a handful of people in the U.S. government. Its budget was buried in the blackest of black projects. When the first KH-11 KENNEN, USA-2, lifted off from Vandenberg Air Force Base on December 19, 1976, it represented not just a new satellite, but a new paradigm. The age of real-time, cinematic surveillance from space had begun. For the analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency's National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C., the first images from KENNEN were a revelation bordering on religious experience. They were not looking at historical snapshots. They were watching live. A Soviet nuclear submarine leaving its pen in Murmansk. Tanks maneuvering on a East German training range. The construction of a new radar installation in Siberia. The imagery was so clear, so rich in detail, that interpreters could identify the types of aircraft on a flight line by the shape of their tail fins, count the exhaust ports on a missile, see the individual tracks on railway lines. The term license plate reading entered the lexicon not as a literal promise, but as a metaphor for a resolution so fine it could capture the mundane details of everyday life, the very detail that would later so disconcert the Soviet analyst with his picture of a toolbox and a newspaper. The shroud had not just been lifted, it had been replaced with a brilliantly lit, ever-present observation platform. But for this new power to achieve its full strategic effect, the men in Moscow had to know it existed. And, paradoxically, their own entrenched worldview would make them the last to believe it. This disbelief would become a weapon in itself, but first, the human and technological architecture that made it possible had to be understood from multiple, interlocking angles. Within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Soviet intelligence, the analyst was not just an interpreter of data, he was a guardian of doctrine. His worldview was built upon a foundation of Marxist-Leninist scientific materialism and a deep understanding of his own nation's technical capabilities. Soviet optical science was excellent, their spy satellites, like the Yentar series, used film return technology. They understood the laws of physics governing telescopes, atmospheric diffraction, and the limits of resolution. To them, the American Corona and Gambit were impressive, but comprehensible. A giant camera in space, shooting film, was a logical, brute force extension of aerial reconnaissance. The alleged capabilities of the rumored American real-time satellite, however, struck at the core of this understanding. To resolve a license plate, an object roughly 12 by 6 inches, from a distance of over 250 kilometers, through the turbulent soup of Earth's atmosphere, defied their calculations. It had to be propaganda, a desinformatia campaign designed to sow paranoia and waste Soviet resources. This belief was a psychological defense mechanism. Accepting the truth meant accepting that the Americans had achieved a fundamental, generational leap in multiple disciplines, optics, stabilization, electronics, while Soviet science had not. It meant every sensitive military site, every shipyard, every research facility, was naked under a constant, unblinking gaze. For the analyst in his Moscow bunker, clutching the damning photograph, dismissing it as a fake was easier than dismantling his entire understanding of the strategic balance and his own nation's place within it. His disbelief was a fortress, and the evidence was a siege engine he refused to acknowledge. The KH-11 was not merely an incremental improvement. It was a systems revolution. Its core was a modified Cassegrain telescope with a primary mirror approximately 2.3 meters in diameter, rivaling large astronomical observatories of the time. This mirror gathered immense amounts of light, but its true genius lay in its shape and polish, designed to minimize optical aberration to the diffraction limit. It was, in essence, a space-based Hubble telescope, decades before Hubble, pointed relentlessly earthward. But the mirror was only the eye. The brain was the revolutionary sensor, the charge-coupled device. Unlike film, which captured a latent image requiring chemical development, the CCD was an array of light-sensitive pixels that generated an electronic signal instantly. This analog signal was digitized, a cutting-edge process in the 1970s, and encoded for transmission. The spacecraft's body, built by Lockheed, was a masterpiece of stability. Using sophisticated momentum wheels and star trackers, it could point its telescope with phenomenal accuracy and hold that gaze, compensating for its own orbital motion to avoid smearing the image. The final, critical link was the data relay satellite system. Earlier satellites had to wait to pass over a ground station to downlink their data. The KH-11, however, could beam its digital stream to a relay satellite in geosynchronous orbit, which would then instantly forward it to ground stations at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, or elsewhere. This created a near real-time surveillance loop. An event observed over Eastern Europe at noon could be on a screen at the CIA's Langley headquarters or the Pentagon's National Military Intelligence Center within minutes. This end-to-end digital chain, from photon to pixel to analyst screen, was what made the license plate mythos plausible. It wasn't about reading alphanumeric characters per se, it was about achieving a ground sample distance of perhaps 15 centimeters. At that resolution, a license plate is a distinct, textured rectangle. A newspaper masthead is a pattern of lines. A toolbox is a collection of shapes. It was a threshold of clarity that moved from observing objects to observing details on those objects, a difference as profound as seeing a truck, and seeing that the truck's tarp was loosely tied. This technological marvel, however, would be inert without a vast, hidden apparatus to task it, process its output, and translate clarity into actionable intelligence. The KH-11 was not an autonomous eye. It was the pinnacle of a vast, global intelligence industrial organism. Its every moment was directed. The process began with collection requirements flowing in from a hydra-headed clientele, the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the White House Situation Room. These requests were prioritized and compiled into a tasking order by the CIA's Office of Development and Engineering. Where should the satellite look next? The choice was a constant strategic dilemma. A new Soviet ballistic missile submarine in the White Sea. A suspected chemical weapons plant in Syria. Troop movements along the inner German border. This order was uploaded to the KH-11 via secure link. The satellite, following its predictable polar orbit, would then automatically slew its telescope to the designated coordinates during its next pass. It could capture images in multiple spectra, not just visible light, but infrared, allowing it to see heat signatures of vehicles recently moved or hidden facilities generating power. The digital stream it generated was a flood of raw data. This is where the second half of the beast awoke. The data downlinked via relay satellite poured into processing facilities at Fort Belvoir's Air Force Foreign Applications Center and the CIA's own labs. Mainframe computers, filling entire rooms, performed initial corrections for atmospheric distortion and satellite motion. The cleaned digital files were then distributed via secure landlines to the analyst's domain, the National Photographic Interpretation Center. Here, in dimly lit rooms, photo interpreters, often with backgrounds in geology, cartography, or architecture, peered at high-resolution monitors. They used stereoscopes for 3D analysis and sophisticated light tables. Their skill was not just seeing, but understanding. They could identify a new type of radar by the shape of its array, estimate the yield of a nuclear test by the crater's dimensions, gauge a tank's mobility by the design of its tracks. The KH-11's detail allowed them to move from counting missiles to assessing their readiness, from spotting a ship to judging its armament. This processed intelligence, stamped with an evaluation of its reliability, then flowed back out to policymakers. The loop, from request, to tasking, to collection, to processing, to analysis, to decision, was compressed from weeks to, in some cases, a single day. The United States had built a central nervous system for global awareness. Beyond the raw intelligence value, the KH-11 bestowed a profound psychological advantage, one that only worked if its full capabilities were ambiguously understood by the adversary. This was the delicate dance of sources and methods. The U.S. went to extraordinary lengths to protect the KH-11's secrets. Its launches were disguised under the bland USA designator. Its existence, though suspected, was officially denied. Analysts were forbidden from using language in reports that would betray its resolution. The metaphor, "can read a license plate," was a useful piece of disinformation in itself. It sounded like an exaggerated boast, deflecting attention from the system's real, more comprehensive capabilities like infrared imaging and real-time monitoring. For the Soviet leadership, this ambiguity created a chilling paradox. They knew they were being watched by something. U-2 overflights had taught them that. But the nature of this new gaze was unknown. Was it merely a better film camera? Or was it something transcendent? This uncertainty bred a strategic paranoia that could be more damaging than the truth. Without knowing the limits of the surveillance, they had to assume the worst. Every security protocol, every deception measure for their most prized weapons systems, their mobile ICBMs, their secret submarines, had to be planned under the assumption that the American eye could see through camouflage nets, count soldiers on a parade ground, or note the peculiar shape of a command vehicle. It forced them into wasteful countermeasures, vast programs to build underground factories, elaborate concealment tactics for military exercises, and a pervasive fear that any innovation would be instantly catalogued. The KH-11, even as a phantom, became a weapon that constrained Soviet military freedom of action. It turned secrecy from a shield into a potentially porous membrane, compelling the USSR to expend billions of rubles and immense intellectual energy not just on hiding things, but on hiding from an eye whose true power they could only fear, but not confirm. This state of corrosive doubt was the perfect environment for the system's secrets to achieve maximum impact when they were finally, catastrophically, revealed not by a technical failure, but by a human hand. That revelation would come in the form of a disillusioned young man and a book of secrets, triggering the climax of this silent war in the shadows. The fortress of secrecy surrounding the KH-11 was, like all human systems, vulnerable to the human element. Its sentinels were not just cipher locks and security clearances, but the loyalty and discretion of the few thousand individuals who knew of its existence. In 1977, one of those individuals was a 23-year-old watch officer at the CIA's Communications Center, William Cumples. Cumples was a figure straight from a John le Carré novel, but with a distinctly American discontent. Ambitious yet frustrated, he felt underutilized and undervalued in his low-level posting. He had been given a thorough security briefing on the KH-11, a standard practice for those with any access to its product, and had even been shown the crown jewel of its documentation, the system's technical description manual, top secret codeword. This bulky, green binder manual was the engineering bible of the satellite. It contained detailed schematics of the telescope's optics, the specifications of the CCD sensors, the stabilization system diagrams, orbital parameters, ground station locations, and crucially, the exact resolution capabilities in both visible and infrared spectra. It did not just describe what the KH-11 could do, it explained, in scientific and engineering detail, how it did it. In early 1978, Cumples, disgruntled and in debt, made a decision of staggering consequence. He removed the manual from the CIA headquarters, a breach of security that went unnoticed. He then embarked on a plan as amateurish as it was devastating. He traveled to Athens, Greece, and made contact with the Soviet embassy, offering to sell them the manual. After initial Soviet skepticism, they suspected a provocation. He was met by KGB officers. The transaction was blunt. He handed over the manual and received a one-time payment of $3,000, a paltry sum for what he was delivering. He then returned to the United States, apparently believing his crime would go undetected. The manual was a windfall beyond the wildest dreams of the KGB's first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, and the GRU's Scientific and Technical Intelligence branches. It was not an analyst's speculative report or a blurred photograph. It was the verified, technical ground truth of the American system. Courier officers immediately transported it to Moscow, where it landed in the secure analysis cells of Soviet military intelligence. For the first time, the men who had dismissed the license plate capability as propaganda now held the engineering schematics that proved it was not only possible, but operational. The theoretical ceiling of American technology was laid bare in precise, numerical terms. The manual confirmed the worst fears and invalidated a core pillar of their strategic disbelief. The enemy's eye was not just powerful, it was exponentially more powerful than their most pessimistic estimates had allowed. The fortress of denial now had a blueprint of the siege engine blasted through its gates. The immediate American reaction was one of profound, but contained, shock. Kumpel's activities had raised flags upon his return. He was placed under surveillance, and his story unraveled under interrogation. He was arrested in November 1978, tried for espionage, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The damage, however, was irrevocable. A frantic damage assessment began within the U.S. intelligence community. How much had been lost? The answer was, everything technical. The systems, sources and methods, were now in hostile hands. But in a grim twist of irony, the very completeness of the betrayal would now set the stage for the final, psychological climax of the story. The Soviet Union now possessed the facts. The next, more difficult step would be forcing its vast, rigid bureaucracy to truly believe them. In Moscow, the Green Binder manual did not trigger immediate celebration. Instead, it initiated a wave of profound professional and institutional trauma. The document was subjected to the full, skeptical machinery of Soviet technical analysis. Teams of optical scientists, aerospace engineers, and signal processing experts from the Soviet Academy of Sciences and KB-1 Design Bureau were brought in under utmost secrecy. Their task, authenticate and evaluate the American manual. Their findings were a collective blow to Soviet scientific pride. The mathematics checked out. The descriptions of the mirror's polishing technique, the stability metrics for the spacecraft, the sensitivity curves for the CCDs, all were not only plausible, but they detailed a level of integration and precision that was, in 1978, about 5 to 7 years ahead of the best comparable Soviet technology. The manual's listed resolution figures confirmed that the license plate metaphor, while colloquial, was a valid representation of a capability to distinguish objects roughly 15 centimeters across. This wasn't disinformation. It was a technical manifesto of American superiority. Now, the evidence collided with the earlier imagery, the photographs of the toolbox, the newspaper, the clear view of individual aircraft canopies. The analysts in the GRU and KGB's scientific intelligence directorates were forced into a painful paradigm shift. The photographs were not fakes. They were demonstrations of a capability they now held the blueprints for. This realization rippled upward through the chain of command with chilling implications. It meant every major strategic asset built over the last 2 years, since the KH-11's launch in 1976, had been under this microscopic observation. The CIA would have watched the construction of the new Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarines at Syeverodvinsk, plate by plate. They would have monitored the testing of the SS-20 mobile missile in Kazakhstan, tracking its transporter erector launcher with ease. They would have an intimate, real-time understanding of the layout and readiness of airbases across the Warsaw Pact. The psychological impact on the senior Soviet leadership, particularly the military and the KGB, was one of naked vulnerability. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and the Politburo were briefed. The reaction was a mixture of fury and grim acceptance. The fury was directed inward, sparking an immediate and ruthless hunt for scapegoats and security failures within their own ranks that had allowed such a system to be built and launched without definitive warning. The acceptance was of a new, unforgiving strategic reality. The Central Committee of the Communist Party issued directives acknowledging the new threat. The era of concealment was over, they were now in an era of managed exposure. This moment, the reconciliation of the damning manual with the once dismissed imagery, was the true turning point. It was not a battlefield victory, but a victory of cognition. The United States had achieved a silent, bloodless coup. It had forced its most powerful adversary to see the world through American eyes, to see their own empire as transparent and perpetually watched. The shock was not merely that the US could see so well, but that the USSR's own intelligence apparatus had been so wrong, for so long. The foundation of Soviet strategic confidence, the ability to hide, to deceive, to prepare in secrecy, had been irrevocably shattered. The Cold War balance had not tipped on a fulcrum of missiles, but on a fulcrum of pure, undeniable clarity. The immediate aftermath of this revelation would be a period of frantic, costly, and often paranoid reaction from the Soviet state, as it scrambled to live under the permanent gaze of an eye it could no longer deny. The confirmation of the KH-11's capabilities triggered an institutional earthquake within the Soviet security and military apparatus. The first order of business was damage control and accountability. The KGB and GRU launched intense internal investigations. Who had failed to predict this leap? Which analysts had dismissed the early imagery as falsification? Careers were ended. Officers involved in scientific and technical intelligence estimation found themselves sidelined, reassigned to remote posts, or forced into early retirement. The atmosphere within the intelligence directorates shifted from one of doctrinal certainty to one of defensive anxiety. A new, harsh mantra took hold: assume the enemy sees everything. This paranoia catalyzed a massive, multi-billion ruble effort to develop countermeasures. The Soviet Union embarked on a crash program to degrade the value of the American satellite's gaze. The most direct approach was physical hardening and concealment. Construction of deeply buried command posts and weapon storage facilities accelerated. The famous dead hand Perimeter system, a semi-automatic nuclear retaliation control complex, was built deep underground, in part due to this new vulnerability. Above-ground strategic assets were shielded. Mobile missile units, like the SS-20 and the new SS-25, were given revised doctrines emphasizing movement under cloud cover, strict emission control (EMCON), and deployment to forested areas where canopy could provide visual shielding, however partial. A second front was deception. Elaborate Maskirovka, military deception, operations were expanded. Inflatable dummy tanks, aircraft, and even missile silos were produced in quantity and deployed to confuse American imagery analysts. Real equipment was shuffled between dummy sites to create a misleading order of battle. The timing of sensitive tests and major exercises was planned around predicted satellite passes, a cat-and-mouse game that consumed immense planning resources. The third, and most ambitious, response was technological: the race to catch up. The Soviet space program, already robust, received renewed emphasis and funding for its own real-time reconnaissance satellite, eventually leading to the development of the Arak series, which employed digital electro-optical technology. While never matching the KH-11's reported resolution, it represented a significant step toward closing the gap. Simultaneously, Soviet research into anti-satellite, ASAT, weapons, like the co-orbital interceptor tested from the Cosmodrome, gained fresh urgency. If they could not hide from the eye, the logic went, perhaps they could blind it. These programs, however, were long-term. For the immediate future, the Soviet military had to learn to operate under permanent surveillance. The strategic impact was immediate and tangible. Arms control negotiations, particularly the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT II, took on a new dynamic. The American delegation possessed an unassailable, fact-based picture of Soviet strategic forces, courtesy of the KH-11. The Soviet side knew the Americans knew. This created a perverse form of transparency that made gross cheating impossible, lending a brittle stability to the talks. The satellite had become the ultimate verification tool, and its exposed capability, ironically, helped underpin the very treaties it was designed to monitor. The USSR was forced to negotiate from a position of exposed reality, not concealed potential. Yet, for all the structural reactions, the deepest wound was psychological. The Soviet leadership's sense of the correlation of forces, the careful calculus of geopolitical power, had been fundamentally altered. They were no longer competing on a level playing field of secrecy. They were in a glass house, throwing stones. This realization would foster a dangerous combination of resentment, insecurity, and a propensity for reckless actions to prove they were not yet fully eclipsed, setting the stage for the global tensions of the early 1980s. The exposure of the KH-11's true capabilities did not end its utility, it transformed its role. The cat was now undeniably out of the bag. In the years following the Kumpel's betrayal, the United States made a calculated decision to gradually, and selectively, declassify the existence and general nature of the system. Satellite imagery, once the most guarded of secrets, began to be used as a public diplomatic tool. The most famous example came in 1984, when the Reagan administration released KH-11 imagery of the immense Soviet Krasnoyarsk radar installation, proving it violated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The evidence was incontrovertible, presented not as agent gossip, but as a photograph from space. The USSR could only bluster in response. The satellite had become an instrument of public statecraft, a means of marshalling global opinion with visual, objective proof. This shift created what analysts would later call the transparency trap. Once the capability was known and partially demonstrated, the Soviet Union had to assume it was being applied constantly. This assumption constrained aggression. During the tumultuous final decade of the Cold War, from the Soviet war in Afghanistan to the military tensions in Europe, the Politburo and the General Staff had to weigh every major maneuver against a simple question: what will the American satellite see? It imposed a caution born of exposure. The 1983 Able Archer crisis, a NATO exercise that the Soviets initially feared was a cover for a real attack, was ultimately defused in part because Soviet intelligence, now hyper-aware of American collection, could find no corroborating evidence of mobilization in real-time KH-11 imagery. The very tool that inspired paranoia also, in critical moments, helped dampen it. For the United States, the legacy was one of entrenched technological superiority and a redefinition of intelligence. The KH-11 proved the value of massive, sustained investment in black-budget science and engineering. It validated the overhead systems approach and led directly to its successors, the KH-12, and the even more advanced KH-11 derivatives that form the backbone of the current-day Keyhole constellation. The architecture Kumpel's betrayed proved so robust that its basic principles, large optics, digital sensors, relay satellites, remained relevant for decades. The program also cemented a new normal, the expectation of persistent, global surveillance. The watch never ended. The human element of the story found its own closure, of a sort. William Kumpel served 18 years of his 40-year sentence before being paroled in 1996, a footnote who had briefly held history in his hands. The Soviet analysts who first refused to believe the evidence were, in time, proven catastrophically wrong, their professional certainty a casualty of the very technological revolution they failed to anticipate. The true victors were the unseen photo interpreters in Washington, whose meticulous work, finally backed by the adversary's own shocked comprehension, had provided the West with its most potent weapon of the late Cold War, not just sight, but the crushing psychological weight of being seen. This new balance of terror was not of mutually assured destruction by missiles, but of mutually assured observation. It was a quieter, more clinical form of deterrence, where the fear was not of annihilation, but of strategic nakedness. It set the precedent for the modern world, where orbital surveillance is a given, and the frontiers of secrecy have retreated to the digital shadows and the depths of the oceans. The battlefield had expanded into the cosmos, and the first decisive engagement was won not with an explosion, but with the silent, relentless gathering of light. The story of the KH-11 and the Soviet disbelief it engenders is not merely a tale of technological one-upmanship. It is a profound lesson in the psychology of power and the limits of perception. It reveals that the most formidable fortress is not one made of concrete and steel, but one constructed of assumptions and dogma. For years, the Soviet analytical mind was imprisoned by its own understanding of the possible, viewing the incredible evidence of American capability through the distorting lens of ideology and technical pride. Their failure was not a lack of eyes, but a refusal to believe what those eyes could be made to see. This episode marked a fundamental transition in the nature of conflict. Warfare had always been shrouded in the fog of war, a Clausewitzian truth. The KH-11, for the first time, began to dissipate that fog for one side, creating what strategists called information dominance. It shifted the advantage from massed, hidden armies to the power of exquisite, timely knowledge. The battlefield became a known quantity, the enemy's order of battle, an open book. This did not eliminate conflict, but it rechanneled it into a competition of innovation, countermeasures, and deception played out under an unblinking eye. Ultimately, the legacy of that clear winter launch in 1976 extends far beyond the Cold War. It established the paradigm of persistent overhead surveillance that now defines our world. The satellites that monitor treaty compliance, track climate disasters, and map our cities are the direct descendants of that first digital eye. The notion that our planet can be watched, in detail, in real time, by powers both public and private, began as a state secret and is now a fact of modern life. In the end, the most enduring truth from this chapter of silent war is a human one: the greatest shock is not the existence of a new weapon, but the dismantling of an old reality. When the Soviet analyst finally accepted the image before him, he was not just acknowledging American engineering. He was confronting the end of an era of strategic mystery, and the dawn of a transparent, and therefore profoundly altered, world. The void of space had been filled not just with machines, but with a permanent, silent witness, a reminder that in the struggle for knowledge, seeing is not just believing. It is power.